Okay. I usually wait till it says that on the screen. All right, good morning and welcome to the Vermont Legislature's House Committee on Environment and Energy. This morning, we are going to hear from Jameson, also known as Jamie Irwin. She's the manager at the Nature for Development Global Program. Welcome, Jamie.
Thank you so much. It's a pleasure to be here. Shall I begin, or how would you like to proceed?
Yes, please begin.
Okay, super. I'm going to share my screen with your permission.
Great. Does she have share screen? Yes. Great.
Wonderful. Thanks so much for this opportunity, and super excited to be here and share some thoughts on, pardon me, get to my beginning slide. Think about Vermont's old forests and why they're essential to protecting our future. So first, a few words about my background. I have lived in Vermont for more than 30 years. I've lived in this house for 29 years. I currently serve on the Duxbury Select Board and have served on the Duxbury Planning Commission, the Land Trust, and also our local Energy Action Partnership. So I have some roots here. A little bit about my academic background. I have a PhD from the University of Vermont that focuses on land use and land use planning and looking at cross-boundary land use for conservation. A little bit about my professional background. I have been working with the United Nations for 14 years, but I also worked with the Nature Conservancy, World Wildlife Fund, the Forest Stewardship Council, which accredits responsible forestry, and also had a stint in Nepal for a few years. And my current job, I support more than 140 countries in developing national biodiversity plans, and I support a bunch of countries on developing protected area and park networks, also looking at nature-based climate solutions, especially forests. I support countries in integrated spatial planning and also develop national global events to raise awareness on the importance of conserving nature, especially for climate and human well-being. So I want to give just a few words about the global context for that I'll share about my observations about Vermont, and I'll conclude with 5 considerations. So there are 3 global frameworks that provide some context. The first is the 2015 adoption of the Sustainable Development Goals by every country on Earth, including the United States. And there are 17 goals, and among these are 2. One is Life on Land that looks at protecting, restoring ecosystems, especially forests, avoiding extinctions, and looking at ecosystem services. So things like resilience from flooding into land use planning, and then climate action, looking at strengthening our resilience. The second major agreement is the same year, the global adoption of the Paris Agreement for Climate, that has a couple of articles relative to forests, including conserving and enhancing carbon sinks, especially forests, but also mangroves and other ecosystems, and encouraging incentives for the protection, conservation, restoration of forests. And then hot off the press from December 22nd of 2022 in a very cold Montreal, was the adoption of a global strategic plan for biodiversity. This is 2 years overdue because of COVID. If they look really tired in that picture, it's because this picture was taken at 3 in the morning when they concluded after a 2-week global event. But important to note for these purposes are that there are of the 22 targets, there are 4 that really have a bearing on this. One is ensuring biodiversity inclusive land use planning. This means not just designating where the next, kind of Williston land use bonanza goes, but also looking at biodiversity inclusion. The second is looking at restoring ecosystems that have been degraded. Third is looking at protecting ecosystems. And the target number 8 is managing nature for climate resilience and climate mitigation. So I've mentioned protection a few times. What is a protected area? It's a defined space. This is Camel's Hump State Park, looking at my front yard, that's recognized, dedicated, or managed through legal means, in this case through a long-term management plan and designation by the state, to achieve long-term conservation of nature. And this is not to say that all parks are strictly protected. We have, in Vermont, we have state parks, we have different variety of wilderness areas, conservation areas. So there's a wide variety of different types of protected areas. It's just a global snapshot of protected areas around the world, we have about 17% of land that is in some form of protection, and about 8% that are in marine protected areas. I want to say a few words about the evolving context, this linkages between nature, climate, and human well-being. This is referred to as the wedding cake. And the basis here is that the biosphere, our forests, our soil, our land, our water, provides all of the societal needs that we have in terms of livelihoods and food and security. And that's the basis of the Sustainable Development Goals. This is a graphic that I did that shows that roughly half of all of the Sustainable Development Goals are dependent on nature. So reducing poverty around the world, food security depends on nature, health and well-being, water security, disaster risk reduction, and climate mitigation. You may have heard of these planetary boundaries. There's a documentary on Netflix with David Attenborough that shows that we've surpassed a number of these safe operating boundaries. And one of these is biospheric integrity. We are using more nature, we're harvesting more than can be replenished. I haven't updated this for the 2023 Global Risks Report. It just came out yesterday, but it's basically more of the same. The top 5 global risks are associated with biodiversity loss, extreme weather, and climate action failure. And when you start to unpack this and say, well, what happens? These risks, climate failure, biodiversity loss, they have a cascade of impacts on the world, including natural resources crises, migration, disease, etc. And I just found out in 3 different sources yesterday in my news feed that the word of the year is polycrisis. There's a VPR story in this as well. But this is the climate crisis, water crisis, food, health, natural disaster. These are all coming together. And it means that when you have a crisis in one area, it impacts another area in a way that's larger than the sum of the parts. The biodiversity emergency is real. The Global Biodiversity Outlook looked at the status and trends of biodiversity. IPBES, which is the Intergovernmental Panel on Biodiversity and Ecosystem Services, and the Living Planet Report have all shown the same trend. We've lost about 70% biodiversity since 1970, when I was 5 years old. And I think many of the people in this room probably can mark that date with some memory. So we are on a trajectory of a greatly depaupered planet. And this has economic risks. More than half of global gross domestic product is at risk from biodiversity loss. The good news here is that this idea of natural climate solutions, that nature can be part of the solution, has been proven in many different studies. On the one hand, our logging, including in Vermont, our traditional agriculture that uses heavy, intensive pesticides and fertilizers creates 24% of greenhouse gases globally. However, nature, if properly managed, can mitigate up to 38% of greenhouse gases. This is great news. But I just want to give a little nuanced notion before I jump into Vermont, and that's that it's not just any forest, it's not plantations, it's older, mature forests really have a key role in sequestering more carbon than younger forests. If you have someone who tells you, oh, you just cut the forest and you're going to have young forests, they're going to sequester more carbon, they are wrong. Older, mature forests are absolutely vital. Large intact patches, especially important intact forested landscapes, are vital for sequestering carbon. The other piece is that forest soils must be accounted for in carbon calculus. You'll hear many people from forest products industry, or indeed from our own esteemed institutions in Vermont, saying that forest management in Vermont is a net zero. It is not. We have to account for carbon soils. So why protect 30% of land? Well, scientists really agree that 30% of protection is the bare minimum required to prevent ecological breakdown at local, regional, and global scales. Protecting 30% would safeguard half of our terrestrial carbon stocks and reduce extinction risk by 90%. The IPBES report showed that we're on path to see about 1 million species extinct by 2050, which seems like a long way off, but if you have kids, you know it's not that long. So this idea of 30 by 30, which is protecting 30% of land and water by 2030, for several years has had a lot of support. This is just a snapshot of some global leading thinkers and dignitaries. We had over 100 heads of state support this notion, and now with the adoption of the global biodiversity framework, 192 heads of state formally have accepted and adopted the 30 by 30 global target. In the US, although the United States is the only country in the world that's not a party to the Convention on Biological Diversity, the Biden administration has this idea of conserving 30% of land and has even made executive orders and begun to explore how forest service lands could be a part of that. And here in state and local leaders are signing on to this. So in 2021, 450 elected officials from 44 states, including 12 from Vermont, have encouraged a 30 by 30 target. Gavin Newsom signed an executive order for 30%. Maine has a plan referencing 30%. And I just saw my news feed about a week ago, New York just passed, hot off the press, a 30% legislation to protect 30% of lands. And we wouldn't want New York to get ahead of us, would we? Support for 30 by 30 in Vermont. Vermont has endorsed 30 by 30 in its climate action plan. It's embedded its 30% commitment in our Vermont conservation design by calling for the protection of older forests with 10% as kind of a floor, a minimum. So how close are we to achieving these goals if indeed we adopt them as state legislature? I'd like to give a few slides of context in Vermont. So Vermont conservation design lays out a clear vision for an ecologically functional landscape of protection that would provide a safety net for climate disasters and a strong solution for our climate crisis, as well as obviously protecting key biodiversity. The reality is a little more nuanced than the vision. So the map on the left from the Nature Conservancy shows that Gap 1, which is strictly protected, is a fairly narrow slice, mostly along the spine of high elevation areas, not particularly high in ecological productivity. Gap 2 is managed for other purposes, and Gap 3 means you can pretty much, it's maintained as protection, but it's also logging is allowed and a number of land uses. The map on the right shows, from BNRC, shows the land of the percentage of land conserved. You can see there, yes, in that spine of the Green Mountains, there is quite a bit of land conserved, but the reality is that there's also a lot of places in Vermont that are not conserved. So the statistics, all land, it's roughly 26%. So in theory, we're not that far off from 30%. You could say another 3.9%, and we will have hit our target. But the percent managed for older, mature forests, remember, these are powerhouses for climate mitigation, are less than 3%. In fact, we have less than 1/100% of land that's categorized as old growth. Mature forests, I'm using here 80 years or older. Percent in Gap 1 status that's strictly protected is only 3.6%. Remember, these are high elevation lands. So you can stand at the top of Camel's Hump and see some great alpine tundra, but there's not a lot of land that's strictly protected. Most Gap 1 lands are high elevation, not well connected, not representative of ecosystems, and not really protected. And as I'll get to in a minute, there's a lot of logging that's taking place or is planned to take place in Gap 3. This is a global snapshot of what the World Database on Protected Areas looks like for Vermont. You can see it's just a fraction, again, because most of the areas in Vermont are not truly protected. So what does all this mean? I have 5 questions and then 5 considerations. Question number 1, are we managing for natural disasters? So there are 2 documents I want to highlight. One is from the EPA looking at planning for flood recovery and long-term resilience in Vermont. And the report said that to mitigate floods, communities should begin by preserving existing undeveloped forest areas. It's the single biggest thing we can do to prevent flooding. A study commissioned by the Forest Parks and Recreation, but not seen since it came out, really, is 90% of Vermont state managed lands are in forested headwaters. These are extremely sensitive for flooding events. They're important for mitigating and reducing the severity of floods. There's a study that came out last year that said the Vermont flood costs could exceed $5.2 billion. I think everyone here is familiar with Irene, and there's no question that these costs are not an exaggeration. This is Ridley Brook. It runs along the road of our small town in Duxbury, and it's really serene. People love to use this as a swimming hole, as a fishing spot. And this is our, so I'm just going to show a little clip. That was during Hurricane Irene. It's our neighbor's house, and the roads demolished. We were actually front page news for a couple of days. This is from Irene, and I'm not going to attribute that this is from forest degradation or forest loss, but what I am saying, will say, is that these types of events are likely to increase. We do not have the forest infrastructure plans in place that will mitigate these impacts. And I'll tell you why. Here again is Duxbury, here's Bolton, Huntington, Fayston, and this is Forest Parks and Recreation's plans to log, which is virtually every parcel that has not yet been logged or has not been logged in some time. This parcel 34 has forests that are 200 years old, at least. We haven't recorded them, but they are well above 38 inches in diameter. So when I look at this map, it raises the question, are we managing for natural disasters, given that FPR's own report said that logging in high elevation or logging in forest headwaters is a significant driver for flooding in Vermont. This is happening all over Vermont, but I want to highlight just this because it is in my backyard. Are we managing, second question, for forest intactness and integrity? These are shots taken across Vermont. I don't think that anyone can look at these photos, even a forester with a straight face, and say, yes, this is managing for forest intactness and integrity. These are large-scale patch cuts that pretty much take away the woody biomass and disturb soils. These forests will take 150 years, 200 years to recover. It's a statewide snapshot that looks at integrity from a slightly different lens. This tiny green bar of less than 1% is considered very intact. This is from satellite data and other data that we've assembled. There is quite a bit of high intact forests. This means that they're under forest cover. Doesn't mean that they're older forests or that they're ecologically robust, rich communities, but they are forests. And then there's quite a bit that is medium low. But the short story here is we have a lot of intact forests. We have very little, very high intact forest. But we have growing problem in terms of parcelization and fragmentation. So we have, however, a very high potential for large forested blocks with high integrity. You can see these large blocks throughout Vermont that don't have roads or have just a singular road, have relatively high integrity, and have the potential to become a safety net for Vermonters. I'll put this in regional perspective. You can see that we are situated between two very high areas of very high integrity to the east and to the west, and to the north and the south, areas of increasing urbanization, suburbanization, exurbanization. Vermont is situated in such a way that we are really key for maintaining this east-west connectivity, north-south connectivity. We are in a unique position, sort of the crossroads between these large areas. Another look at, are we managing for forest and intactness and integrity? We have a very high potential for intergenerational turnover of lands. We are going to see increased forest subdivisions for housing, increased roads for rural, exurban, peri-urban, suburban development. The green shows the loss of acres in parcels greater than 50 acres, and the red shows areas of greater than 3%. I fully expect, given the intergenerational turnover we're likely to see in the next 10 to 20 years, we'll see a lot more red and orange in the map, meaning that 100 acres, 200 acre parcel by a family gets given to their kids in their will, and the kids can't decide how to manage it, and they decide to sell it for its highest and best use, which is development. So we will see a lot more continued development and subdivision and roads. This is just from just down the road from us. It's just a typical family logging it first and subdividing it second. And this is what Vermont private lands pretty much looks like. This is another satellite imagery, composite imagery that I have globally, but this is Camel's Hump on the left. And when you think about Camel's Hump Park, just as a substitute for all of state parks in Vermont, you imagine a kind of pristine forest. Maybe you've hiked it a few times, but actually it's been logged many, many times in the past. There are areas of degradation, and you can see that degradation throughout the landscape, even in this small thumbnail of a sketch. Third question, are we managing for regional connectivity? I alluded to that when I showed that image of Vermont as a regional powerhouse. This is a study commissioned by the Nature Conservancy that shows that Vermont areas, including this area of Greens to Adirondacks and the Berkshire wildlife linkages and Worcester Range to Northeast Kingdom, these are all really critical spaces. And just to give you a snapshot of one of those, this links to the Connec Range and then up north of Rutland in Vermont. These are really critical connectivity patches that are not really being considered at a state level at current, especially when it comes to managing public lands in Vermont. Fourth, are we managing for human health? My neighbor runs a kennel, she said, for the first time in living here for 45 years, her dogs tested positive for Lyme disease this winter. We are seeing an uptick in ticks, no pun intended, and climate change will exacerbate this increase. We are seeing in Vermont an increase in tick populations. Logging and forest degradation increases the tick population. That is a direct correlation. Are we managing for carbon sequestration? My fifth question. When you look at a map of carbon potential, the Northeast just kind of pops. There's an enormous amount of land with high amounts of terrestrial carbon that is not protected in the Northeast. And a number of science papers call for an increase of at least 5% of land as climate reserves for climate stabilization. The Northeast is one area where this really shines. So are we managing for carbon sequestration? This map from our UN Biodiversity Lab shows that there's quite a bit of carbon that Vermont could sequester. In fact, over 826 megatons. But when you look at the map of protected lands that are strictly protected, the vast majority of lands with high carbon are not at all protected from logging, from subdivision, from roads. I believe that Bill Muma is with us, so apologies if I'm taking your quote out of context, but I'm sure you'll have something to say on that. Is that Vermont Forest, first of all, from Dr. William Keaton, Vermont Forest could store 2.3 to 4.2 times more carbon than they currently store if we just let them grow old. That means not logging them, not having interventions, just letting them grow old. And Dr. William Muma has said the most effective thing that we can do for carbon is to allow trees that are already growing to continue to grow, to reach their full ecological potential in storing carbon. This is logging in Vermont on public lands. In the last 8 years, Vermont plans to triple logging on public lands. Vermont state plant management plans do not prioritize maintaining mature, intact forests for their carbon sequestration value. That is definite. So one thing I want to say before I leave this slide is that, moreover, we do not have the tools on private lands to ensure the protection of 10% of forest, to allow them to grow old, to fulfill their role in Vermont's carbon plans, climate plans. If we are to achieve our goals, public lands are absolutely essential. So I'd like to conclude with 5 considerations, plus a bonus consideration for tackling this biodiversity, climate, human well-being nexus that we have in Vermont. The first consideration is that I really encourage you to consider adopting ambitious protection targets that will create a nature-based safety net for Vermont, and that's endorsing the Climate Action Plan's 30 by 30 commitment and enshrining this in legislation to have a 30% commitment as a baseline, as a minimum. Second, we are out of alignment between how we manage lands and our carbon and climate aspirations and our conservation aspirations. I urge the committee to align Vermont Forest Parks and Recreation and the Vermont Fish and Wildlife plans with Vermont's Conservation Design and Climate Action Plan by prioritizing the protection of at least 10% of mature forests on public lands. Third is to reconsider state land designation. Right now, our state parks are somewhat of a piñata that people that are sort of seeing that they can provide all things to all people. Well, the truth is they can't. There's certainly room for logging in state forests and et cetera. But if we're to achieve our climate goals, our disaster risk reduction goals, I really think we need to rethink the designation of state lands. So I encourage this committee to consider avoiding logging in Vermont state parks. That alone would provide a huge amount of land that could be, not a huge amount, but a significant chunk of high carbon, high biodiversity, high areas high for disaster risk reduction for Vermonters. The fourth is create incentives for private landowners to manage for older mature forests and large blocks. Right now, we really don't have, I know there's been an update to the use valuation appraisal, which is highly welcome. I think we have to have a wildlands category and really rethink how we have incentives in place for private landowners to maintain those big chunks of forests that are providing us with ecosystem services that enable them to continue to do so. And then finally, almost finally, is to engage in statewide integrated spatial planning exercises that really prioritizes carbon sequestration, disaster risk mitigation, especially flood resilience for Vermont communities, forest connectivity, and large older intact forests. Right now, we have a mishmash within the state government on how we think about and manage our lands. Last consideration, this is my husband. He loves to go out and find big trees. This big old maple is a 39-inch in diameter, a very rare area in Warren. It's one of a few. And I was with our son, and he said, "Why is this tree so big? Why is this tree so big?" And I think what happens is that when Vermont's native forests were 30 feet in diameter, they were 25 feet, they're 10 feet in diameter, they were they were enormous. And we now have this shifting baseline that it's typical to see a tree that you can put your arms around pretty easily. And in fact, old forests are incredibly important to our ecosystems, to carbon, to water security. And so the last consideration is the future. With that, I'm going to stop sharing and take any questions that you might have. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you. Representative Sibilia, then Smith.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Madam Chair, I want to apologize for having to step out. And Jameson, I apologize for stepping out briefly during your presentation. Hopefully I didn't miss the part of my question that I'm going to ask now.
Tell me.
I appreciate your presentation. I'm looking forward to going through the maps and the data. It's a great reference tool. As someone who feels I support the need for use of wood and recreational use of our lands, wood for building. We still need wood for heating at this point. We haven't transitioned away from that yet. Help me understand where should we log in Vermont? So where are the places that we should? I think I understood where the places are that we should not. But where are places that we should? Help me understand how to prioritize that.
That's a great question. And I think there's a perception sometimes that we're, quote, exporting deforestation, which is really not the case. State lands are just a tiny fraction of the wood that Vermont uses. I think that there's an incredibly important role for private land managers to have sustainable forestry operations throughout Vermont. I think of woodlots that Vermonters manage sustainably. And I think that there's numerous opportunities for sustainable forest management throughout Vermont. I just don't think that state parks should be the breadbasket for heating people's homes. I think that areas that are managed for early successional forests are also important. So having forests that are 40, 50 years old and in rotation are super important as well. I think what we're missing here is that the state lands really have an incredibly important role in providing those ecosystem services, flood resilience, carbon sequestration, biodiversity, that landowners can't be expected to bear. Landowners need to pay the taxes. They need to put their kids through school. So I guess to answer your question, the answer is everywhere else that is not part of this need to protect state lands.
May I ask one follow-up question, Madam Chair?
Yeah.
So in that regard, so I'm hearing you say private lands and private landowners are the place to have that. I wonder about, and this is not my area of expertise, Madam Chair, I'm learning here. So with FPR, so on private parcels, when we have logging, who is ensuring that that is done? Who do we count on to ensure that that is done with best practices? Are there any regulations on private land? And I'm not looking necessarily for there to be, but are there incentives for doing that in a best practices way? Are there supports for loggers? I don't necessarily understand that.
Okay, great question. And there are a couple embedded in there. I'll try to unpack it. The first is, are there incentives? The answer is yes. I think that the use value appraisal provides an incentive for landowners to not pay the quote highest and best use for taxes by managing their woodlot, by having a certified management plan that's endorsed by a forester that says, yes, this follows some rationale. There are acceptable management practices for logging, for example, close to waterways that provide a safeguard for people, from logging in waterways. The question about incentives. There are certification schemes. One of them is here in Vermont. It's one of a few globally called Rainforest Alliance, and they do certify small landowners as well. So I'm thinking of Vermont Family Forest, run by David Brin, a former county forester for the state of Vermont. So there are county foresters who assist landowners with developing forest management plans. So there are certainly safeguards and bumpers for sustainable forest management. There are some incentives. I think the use value appraisal steps in having some areas off limits for logging is a good start. I'd love to see more. I think the next one is having a conservation easement. So a forever wild easement allows land to be forever wild, but certainly the Vermont Land Trust allows landowners to have their land in an easement, and that means their tax rate is reduced and they're able to continue sustainable forestry for their families, for the future. It just means that their land won't become a subdivision or something like that. So they do get reduced taxes. So there are incentives in place, both from third-party certification outfits like Rainforest Alliance, as well as from easements, as well as from the tax state appraisal.
Thank you. I actually have a bunch more questions, which I'm not going to have time to ask, specifically around how we're using the technical knowledge that we're paying for at FBR to make sure that we're doing a good job with all of this. So love to follow up with you. And
please feel free. I'm sure that Kate can share my contact details. I welcome any and all communications and happy to share this presentation as well as whatever other knowledge I have. Very happy to help.
Thank you.
Representative Smith.
Thank you. Thank you for your presentation. And you had mentioned just a little while ago that plans to triple logging in Vermont on public lands. Would you say that that should not happen? Is that what I'm hearing?
I have my own opinions and I'm happy to share them. I think that at the moment, what I see in both the US federal plans, and I'm thinking here of Telephone Gap, this is a 150 to 200-year-old forest that should not be logged, in my opinion, is on the chopping block. When you look at federal plans for Vermont, there are quite a few older mature forests that should not be logged, in my opinion. Whether or not Vermont should log its state parks, that's of course, right now it is the law that they can and that they should in fact, but when I look at the preponderance of evidence on the importance of older forests for climate, for flood resilience, and I take this personally, I live in Duxbury, I saw Hurricane Irene, I saw the impacts. I can only imagine if Forest Parks and Recreation were to carry through the logging of 3,750 acres in our little watershed, what that would look like. So my view is that it needs to be much more purposeful, much more considerate, much more thoughtful approach to logging on Vermont managed lands. I say managed, I don't say Vermont owned lands. They are owned by the people of Vermont. I don't think that FPR has taken a really clear-eyed look at the role of forests in climate sequestration and disaster risk reduction.
Thank you. One other question. I noticed in your resume that you appear to be quite worldly as far as being an environmentalist, and I applaud you for that. Can you tell me what is going on in Brazil right now? Are there any rainforests left? That's the most crucial ecosystem in the world.
It's a great question. Yes, there are rainforests left. Yes, that Lula has been elected and Bolsonaro is out, and Lula has prioritized the protection of the Amazon. He's made an indigenous woman as the Minister of Environment. There are some steps. One of the biggest dangers in the Amazon is a tipping point. And this applies to Vermont as well. When you start cutting a certain threshold, you have a situation where the Amazon right now is a big carbon sink But once it starts to, it's burning, it's being converted to pasture and beef, it starts to emit carbon more than it sequesters carbon. And that's a huge problem for the world. I also want to say that I am an environmentalist. I have worked in this field, but my first really professional gig was working on sustainable forestry, looking at setting up the Forest Stewardship Council, which is a global system that accredits about a third of forest products worldwide, and in fact accredits Rainforest Alliance here in Vermont. The point is not that every forest needs to be saved at all. It's that we need a more purposeful, a more 21st century look at where the world is headed. And that's where I can say from my 30 years sum of experience is that currently Vermont is not looking at the climate crisis in its land management plans and procedures.
Thank you.
Thank you for the question.
Members have other questions? Seeing any? Thank you very much for your testimony this morning.
Pleasure is mine. Do you mind if I hang on for a little bit and listen to?
Oh, yeah, thank you. Look, I circled that. I was just reminded that we would love to get you to send your slides to our committee assistant.
I shall do that right away.
We can review them for follow-up. Thank you.
Thank you. And again, I am available for any follow-up questions you may have. I'm happy to share whatever data, whatever articles, whatever would be helpful to this committee. Thank you again for your time.
Thank you. Committee, I'd like to take a 5-minute break till quarter to 10, 9:45.